Welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. And this is, thank whichever divine you follow, the final research episode for the Venice material. It isn't that I've researched all of the things that were on the shopping list that I put in a previous episode. It's that you get to a point where the research begins to make you want to give the project up, and at that point you really should start writing. The final set of notes are from Housecraft and Statecraft, Domestic Service in Renaissance Venice, 1400 to 1600, and we begin with some terminology notes. In Latin, the term domestici are people who live in the same house, and familiari are people who live in one family, which may include servants and the people who they call familiars, which doesn't mean the same thing that we mean in Ars Magica. It means people who are an extended, dependent part of the family. Then we have some lovely Latin, which we will probably use in the game for flavour. The terms are servitor, famulus, famulus in domo, and servitor in simba, which means servant, manservant, house manservant, and a servant in the gondola. Also, bacuoli, which means gondolier or boatman, and less commonly fante, which means boy, familiaris, which we've already discussed, camighieri, which means chamberlain, remo, which means oarsman, nauta, which means sailor, gastaldus, which means steward, and for the female servants, ancilio, which means handmaid, fantesca, which means serving girl, massara, which means housekeeper, famula, which means female servant, domicula, which means housegirl, pedisqua, which means footmaid, cameriera, which means chambermaid, donzella, which means lady-in-waiting, and balia, nana, and nutrix, which mean wet nurse or governess. Also anime, which means indentured servant. There are then some notes on books that I should follow up, but I'm not going to at the moment, and on the Ascension clock. Ascension is an idea from modern folklore studies. That is, I think it's from Foucault. It's when your actions make a piece of folklore real. That is, they bring the piece of folklore into the real world by allowing it to alter your actions. He has stolen the term. In Catholic services, the Ascension is the bit where the priest holds up the wafer to allow you to see Jesus. The idea of the Ascension clock is as the characters complete their adventures, if they favour the player of games, the fairy aura of Venice will get deeper, so achronal elements will become more severe. The Carnivale will become less and less like it is in the 12th century, and more like it is in the 15th and 16th century. The great fleets will be less like they are in the 12th century, and more like they are at the high point of Venetian shipbuilding. And when the Ascension clock gets to the maximum setting, 10, then at that point the Dogeressa in glass and the Dogeressa in stone manifests into the world through the stones of Venice. So it gets the carnival longer, servants become more worldly and corrupt and rebellious, the Arsenale gets bigger. Those of you who've played Pendragon have seen something similar to this. It's the Pendragon era system. Notes on the corruption of servants. The writing about servants in medieval Venice is generally by rich people, and they depict their servants as childlike and carefree. They also say that they are less sinful than their masters because they have less temptation, because they have less freedom, and therefore the master is doing their servant a favour by keeping all the worries of the world away from them. In parallel, there are other works that say that servants are generally lazy and steal from their masters. Servants are, later, seen as a reflection of their masters. Wet nurses are thought to impress flaws into the children who they nurse, and so there are some substantial authors who suggest noble women must breastfeed their own children so that the children are impressed with nobility. Notably, most noble women don't agree with them. Children are sometimes given governance over servants so that they can learn how to rule a household, because ruling a household is seen as a parallel of ruling a state. Similarly, a person who is in public office who can't rule his own servants is suspected of being incompetent in his role as a politician. Yet more books for me to cross-check. Spataforza notes that servants are generally healthier than their masters because work is good for their health, and he notes that there is a precipitate decline in the health of doges once they gain the position. That being said, most doges are in their 80s, so I think his point that stress and sitting down are bad for them, however true it may be exaggerated. Glosenti, tricks from gondoliers. Gondoliers charge tourists more than the legally set fare, and they do this by claiming that it's a feast day, or that they're rowing against the tide, or that the weather is bad. Sometimes they refuse to land until they're paid off, and sometimes they rock the boat until they're paid to travel more smoothly. A ferry station's called a traghetti, and we'll get back to those later. Most gondoliers don't work in service to a nobleman. They pick up fares from the traghetti. But those who do hire out to a nobleman for an extended period are believed to conspire with his other servants to rip him off because they have a method of getting smuggled goods out of the house, to punish him for not letting the gondolier live in the house by keeping him waiting at weird places at night, to get tips and treats from the woman in the house with the children, when carrying the house's wood, wine, or other supplies, to steal some and put it under the poop of the gondola, and to take a share of any picnics that the family has, and if they don't get a share of the food, to steal a gilded knife or a silver fork. Second chapter, Laws on Servants. The first big set of laws on servants are passed in 1541. The Council of Ten passes a law that enables 2 censors and 1 state attorney to cut down on the insolence of boatmen and servants, and their goals are to break up bonds and agreements between the lower classes, anti-union activity essentially, to enforce humility, to stop them being immoral and disgusting, and these 3 were allowed to punish by the drawing of blood if 2 of them agreed, and punish with death if all 3 agreed. This has parallel to the city's control of labour guilds, which were discussed in previous episodes. Originally, servants were restrained by the capi di sestieri. The capi di sestieri, as a position, were created in 1171. That's a traditional date. Each capo di sestieri was supported by 4 guards or wardens, and they patrolled that sestieri. They also had at least 1 notary to keep track of who'd been caught and what they'd been doing. The capo is elected by the nobles who live in that sestieri, and they supervise the cape di contrade, who are the heads of the approximately 70 parishes in the city. The capi di sestieri are required to be at their offices in the Rialto for 3 days a week to hear cases. They also supervise inns and taverns, and the capi di contrade are required to spy on foreigners. The capi di sestieri are in charge of sex work, and at least originally have control of the contracts between masters and servants. Apprentices are not in this system. They're under the Giustizieri Vecchi, and registration is required. In 1402, all contracts of apprenticeship need to be witnessed directly by the Justices Vecchi. The distinction between apprenticeships and servitude is not clear at the time. There are law cases that try and distinguish it, and it is particularly blurry in female-dominated trades. In 1368, a law is passed that all slave sales must be from the Rialto, and that there is a license required from the capi di sestieri to sell slaves. In 1386, the capi di sestieri start registering anime, that is, indentured servants, to make sure they're not resold later as slaves. No indenture can be longer than 4 years. The anime tend to be young people from the Balkans, which is being invaded at the time. In 1388, the maximum length of the indenture is lengthened to 10 years. Note that salaried servants are not, at this point, registered. In 1541, the censors take the role of looking after servants from the capi di sestieri and extend their role to salaried servants. In 1503, all laws on servants are collected into a single capitulary, single book, and it has some useful things for us. Servant contracts can't be longer than 10 years. Beating servants to trick them into breaking their contract by flight is popular, and it's explicitly disallowed. Fornicating servants could be whipped, but only if the act was in the master's house. Similarly, they could be branded. Torture is permitted in such cases, but that's carried out by the Signore di Notte. In 1410, Niccolò Barbo, who is the son of a prominent political figure, I can't remember who, is murdered. And this is because he discovers that his Tartar slave, Bona, is pregnant, and he beats her with a sort of harness used to carry water. So she goes to a pharmacy on St. Pantalon, and she buys arsenic, which is used for killing rats and other domestic things. It's also used as makeup. Moving on. So she buys some poison. She doses him the first time, he doesn't die. She doses him again, he dies. And she's caught and she's burned at the stake in the middle of the piazza. And there's a ban put on all toxins and poisons for sale anywhere but the Merceria, which is a particular street of merchants. There is one exception. There are two streets from St. Zulian to the Rialto, which are still allowed to sell poison, but the poison has to be kept under lock and key, only handled by the druggist, not by their servants, and you can only buy it if you already have a receipt from the Giustieri Vecchi saying that you are allowed to have it. There is a list of prescribed substances, but I don't have that list. I'll use that for a plot hook. Citizenship is progressively withheld from the children of slaves, serving girls, and women of, quote, low status. This could also go into the ostension clock. The censors are created in 1517 to uncover electoral corruption, and then they're dismissed in 1521, and then they're restarted again in 1524. When that happens, they add policing gambling to their functions. In 1541, they take over all cases involving servants. In 1544, the Signori di Notte are divided into two branches, the Signori di Notte al Civil and the Signori di Notte al Criminal. When this happens, the Capi di Sestieri are discontinued as no longer having a non-paralleled function. There is a lot of whipping and branding threatened in the capitulary that was previously mentioned. There's also a note that servants may not wear silk, and that if a noble catches a servant wearing silk, they get the clothes. In 1537, there is a new policing office, the Executors Against Blasphemy, and then in 1547, there is another new office which investigates heresy. The capitulary sets maximum wages. Nobles were not meant to bid higher and higher rates to steal each other's servants. In the plague of 1575 to 1577, servants become scarce and their pay increases substantially regardless. In the 16th century, servants are seen as accessories and accoutrements, particularly male servants who are taken out of the house. They're given uniforms, even in silk, and it's considered better to have two gondoliers than one. This makes their masters more vulnerable to shame because of the disloyalty or disorderly conduct of their servants. There's a note here that street brawls are dealt with by neighbourhood patrols appointed by the Capi di Sestieri or the Cinque alla Pace, which are the police magistrates. Theft, rape, and murder are investigated by the Signori di Notte al Criminal, and the censors look after masters and servants. Then there's a list of servant offences, but we'll skip that. The Doge's Promissione says he has 20 servants between the ages of 20 and 60 male, and armed at his expense with iron weapons. They are a bodyguard of last resort. Every member must be a Venetian. From 1275, no one can bring weapons into the ducal palace while the Great Council is in session. They essentially leave them together like a cloakroom. After 1266, no one may wear the arms of a noble on their shield or on their weapon, because these are treated as gang signs. After 1266, underlings in public service are not allowed to wear noble badges. They must wear the insignia of St. Mark on their sleeve or shield. In 1310, the Querini-Tiepolo conspiracy breaks out. That's an attempt by a noble family with some military support to take over the government and institute an autocracy similar to that found in other northern Italian city-states. Some changes to the ducal household. In 1289, the ducal household has two knights, and these act as master of the bedchamber, and they have a rule against the receipt of gifts. 3 kitchen supervisors, a notary, a keeper of the seal, a priest and an acolyte to say mass. And there's a note that this retinue is far smaller than northern kings or other northern dukes. In 1486, this is cut back a bit. All of these jobs are jobs for life, and over time they become sinecures for people who are politically skilled. The chevalier, the knight in a later stage, changes title to the French form, physically supports the doge. They're the doge's body man. This is because the doges are mostly in their 80s. The servants, who are called scuderi, gather each morning to accompany the Duke to the Collegio, and they do crowd control. And they also carry symbols of office during important parades. 2 of them act as guards on the ducal bedchamber, and they have a weekly rotation. Once many of these roles become stipendiary, the actual work is done by other people. The steward arranges feasts. Servants of the upper level are lodged in the ducal palace. Many of these posts are deliberately held by people of middle or low rank. For example, in 1578, one of the scuderi was an ex-slave. The reason for this is so that a noble family can't get its hooks into the government. The Doge, in addition to this public staff, has a private staff of personal servants who do the non-role related duties like cooking, non-banquets, looking after their personal possessions. In the late 16th century, the dogeressa's role is amped up, and so she requires more servants. Similarly, widowed dogeresses are given government subsidies so that they can have a certain number of servants for the dignity of the state. And then it moves on to discussing a patrician's household. It again defines the fraterna, which we've covered in previous episodes. Essentially, rich Venetian families like to keep the money concentrated by working as a single business unit, and to stop the money spilling out, only 1 or 2 of the children would marry and have children of their own. The surplus women would go to convents. The surplus men would either enter the church or become sort of merchant adventurers who, if they made enough bank, would separate themselves from the fraterna and have their own household, or alternatively leave all of their wealth to their nephews and their mistresses. Living in fraterna is cheaper because it allows each of the nuclear households in the fraterna to share servants, cooks, for example. The Priuli family, which is discussed, has a member of the Council of 10, so the highest level of society. It notes that the oldest son has 1 male servant, and the next son, who is married, has 1 male, 1 female, and 2 wet nurse servants. The third son is not in Venice, he's in England. In a later census, the head of the family, Lorenzo, his wife, Paola, and their 3 sons, their 2 wives, and up to 6 grandchildren have at least 10 servants. Each adult essentially has 1 servant of the same gender, plus there are wet nurses and governesses for the children, and as the children age, there are fewer servants because the wet nurses and governesses are reduced in number. Toward the end of the records we have for this fraterna, the oldest brother gets a second servant. He gets a gondolier, but there's reason to believe that these were shared around throughout the family, so he was the brother's gondolier legally, but in terms of his daily work, he probably ferried around everyone in the house. Then the census information from the Barbarigo family. They are not a political family. It was a young up-and-coming man who wanted to keep all of his money liquid, so he didn't buy a house, he rented a house, and he rented a slave until he marries and has a couple of sons. Around this time, he buys 3 more slaves, but he rents out 1 for the rest of that slave's life because he has more slaves than he needs. As his children are born, he hires a wet nurse each time, although he's unusual in that he doesn't have any male servants. The first half of the 15th century is the peak for the slave trade. In 1469, after Barbarigo dies, his widow buys the house that they are renting. His children, who are brothers, live in fraterna. The oldest one has a wife and 2 children, and their servants are Lena, who is a companion for the widowed mother, who used to be a wet nurse for one of the brothers. 1 male indentured servant, 2 female indentured servants, 2 wet nurses, and 1 or 2 slaves. Slaves were considered cheaper because you paid everything up front. The younger brother dies without children. The older has 11 children with his wife. 4 of these are boys. One of these, when he grows up, separates off because he wants to be in politics, and so he rents closer to the centre of power, and the process of separating off is a legal process. He's split from the fraterna. The 3 brothers are served by 1 or 2 female servants. Male servants are more likely to live away from the house and commute, especially gondoliers. Accommodation is often part of the wage and salary package given to servants. Sometimes elderly servants are left the use of accommodation, particularly if it's not in the main house. A cittadino household is the next social status down as citizen. The most significant citizen is the Grand Chancellor, who mustn't be noble. They're elected for life, they supervise the chancery, and they officiate at the most important meetings of state. The politics for the election are intense, and they have a similar pattern of 1 servant per adult, although at one stage the Grand Chancellor, because he may not be noble but he is rich, has a household of himself, his wife, 10 other adults, and 8 children. Of that household, 4 are male and 8 are female servants. The Spinelli family accounts are of 2 middle-class adults, and they have 1 female servant, and they constantly have 1 female servant ticking over to a new female servant as each one retires. They were clearly quite good to their servants. They have expenses for medicine, burials, and loans after they retire. Their servants stay with them for an extremely long time. Most servants stay less than a year. And when they're looking to fill places, they fill them, in some cases, in a couple of days. After 1539, prostitutes were not allowed to have servants under 30 years of age because it was thought that they would apprentice them in sex work. There were similar laws for Jews, with the additional burden that Christians could not live in with Jews. Jews were required to have a license to have Christian servants. Adoption's a relatively common occurrence in medieval Venice, and it's increasingly popular in the 15th and 16th century. Adoptees are, in some senses, similar to servants. The population of the city peaks in 1575 or thereabouts. Estimates are anywhere between 120,000 and 196,000 people, and then the plague in 1575 to 1577 kills off 10% of the population. It works its way back up again, and then in the plague of 1630 to 1631, 30% of the population die. The 1563 census says that there were 15,170 nobles, 18,939 citizens, 127,746 artisans, 539 poor or beggars, and 6,233 religious and Jewish persons in the city. That religious breakdown is friars, 1,196, nuns, 2,134, hospital patients, 1,479, and Jews, 1,424. In the census, there are 12,908 servants, which makes up 7.65% of the population. However, in this census, no artist has a servant. This is clearly wrong. There are more female servants than male servants. So, as a rough rule of thumb for design of covenants, there is 1 servant per noble man, woman, and child, 1 servant for every 2.5 citizens, and after the plague, the proportion of servants plummets. Also, the male proportion of servants is somewhere between 30% at its lowest and 40% at its highest. The author I'm following is not sure if there were slave markets or servant markets. A lot of hiring is by social connections. Masters often hire the relatives of their current servants. Rapid turnover is a problem because you have to train your new servants. Servants expect wages. Some get them monthly, some get them annually. Wages and tips are expected at New Year and at Censa. Censa is a special festival for servants held at the Ascension. There is a table of wages, but we're going to skip it because we'll just use the mythic penny. Female servants are far cheaper, and that's why there are more of them. Payments for wages are sometimes delayed if the master is strapped for cash. Some masters keep their servants' wages in trust, which is called in salvo. Bachelors sometimes have quasi-marital relationships with their servants, and when the bachelor dies, the servant then needs to sue for their wages to support themselves. Many people formally enter service at about the age of 9 or 10. It says here early teens, maybe 9's an average. Many girls in the artisan class spend 5 to 10 years in service to save for a dowry. Some contracts make the employers responsible for marrying off their servant girls. They often leave service at marriage and return later if their finances require. The primary duties of male servants are to clear a path through crowds for their master and to carry torches at night. Also, to lead their master's funeral procession, collect the master's goods, receive goods at the house, and deliver messages. They also participate in the master's quarrels and crimes. In addition to this, of course, the gondoliers have to care for the master's boats and provide transport. Gondoliers wait for their masters a lot. The government hates this because they're worried that the gondoliers will get together and organise. They also think they make the Rialto look scruffy. There are traghetto stations along the Grand Canal and around the city periphery. Traghetti act like guilds, so you might have one run by Magi. They are closed corporations. Membership is only by vote of members, and the major duties of traghetti are election of new members, scheduling work shifts so that there are always gondoliers around, protecting their territory from neighbouring traghetti, maintaining the cavana, which is the mooring station, and the casotto, which is the hut, and many of them maintain scola, which are the semi-religious organisations that we've discussed in previous episodes. Many male servants want to save up, get a boat, leave service, and join a traghetto station. Theft, smuggling, and rape by male servants are common. It's harder for female servants to pinch things because they don't leave the house as often, so they can't pass material off as easily. Boatmen hang out at the traghetti and the quays at the Rialto and at San Marco and at the boatyards, and they drink and gamble and gossip. They curse a lot. Their habit of cursing and using obscene gestures is, in the book I'm following, called an anti-language. Its purpose is to create a sense of solidarity within the social group. The main duties of female servants are to maintain the home, care for children, and accompany the mistress. There are 3 types. The most respected are wet nurses and governesses. They are also the best fed. Below them are chambermaids, who look after the family's provisions and accompany the mistresses in travel. And underneath that are what we'd call maids of work in the English situation. They do the cooking, the cleaning, manual work. Among servants, informal friendship networks are very important. For female servants, the Scuola Piccola, the local parish church confraternity, is where they tend to socialise. They also socialise at wellheads and at the parties of their masters. The largest of the scuolas, attended by female servants, is the Schola of St. Ursula, and it has devotees across the city. Then there are some notes on the censer fare. Tips and advances in pay are given so that servants can attend the censer. It's a fare not for the great goods that foreign traders come for. It's small gifts and ornaments and, in female servants, stuff for trousseaux. Aged servants often lost their job once they could not perform physical labour. They resorted to begging, food selling, washing and keeping vigil over dead bodies, candle selling, prayer reciting, joining convents under third order vows, or accompanying their mistress into a convent. Hospitals existed for the deserving poor, but could not fully accommodate all of the aged servants, and some of them were maintained in the master's home. There are no servant guilds. And then there is, once again, another note that Venetian households are far smaller than those of nobles in other states. And that is us. Now we begin the drafting. Your saga may vary.